The Young and the Restless, Spoilers Shock. Nick had sensed for some time that something was off with Sharon. Her behavior had become erratic, and her once stable demeanor had started to crumble before his eyes. For weeks, he had observed small changes, subtle at first, but growing more concerning with each passing day. Sharon's once carefully regulated routine of taking her medication had fallen by the wayside. Nick had seen the pill bottles sitting untouched on the counter, growing dustier as time went on. She had stopped taking her prescribed meds, and the consequences were beginning to show. For a while, Nick had tried to push the troubling thoughts to the back of his mind, convincing himself that maybe Sharon had it under control. But as the days stretched into weeks, his concerns grew. Sharon was sleeping less, her eyes perpetually ringed with exhaustion. Nick had seen her pacing through the house late at night, restless and unable to sleep, caught in a cycle of insomnia. It was more than just stress, something deeper, something darker. Nick wasn't the only one who had noticed Sharon's decline. Mariah, her daughter, had been quietly observing her mother for some time. She had noticed that Sharon seemed to be having conversations with herself, mumbling under her breath. At first, Mariah thought it might be nothing, just stress from work or fatigue from lack of sleep. But one night, Mariah overheard a chilling conversation, one that sent a shiver down her spine. Sharon was talking to someone, a presence in the room that only she could see, and she was calling that presence by a name Mariah hadn't heard in years: Cameron. The realization hit Mariah like a punch to the gut. Cameron was dead, long dead. But here Sharon was, speaking to him as if he were alive, as if his ghost were still haunting her. Mariah's fear for her mother's mental state grew with each passing day. Something was terribly wrong, and Sharon's refusal to take her medication only seemed to be making it worse. Nick confronted Sharon one morning after catching her in the middle of yet another sleepless night. He had seen her wandering through the house, lost in her thoughts, and knew he couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Sharon, we need to talk," Nick said, his voice firm but laced with concern. Sharon, looking startled, turned to face him, her eyes darkened with exhaustion. "What is it, Nick?" she asked, trying to brush off the tension. "I've noticed you haven't been taking your medication," Nick said bluntly, his tone serious. "Why aren't you following the doctor's orders? You need those meds to stay balanced, Sharon." Sharon's expression faltered, but she quickly recovered, offering a weak smile. I just forgot, Nick. Been a lot lately and I lost track of time. I'm fine, really." But Nick wasn't buying it. He had known Sharon long enough to recognize when she was lying. "This isn't something you can just forget, Sharon," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "You haven't taken your meds in weeks, and you're not sleeping. You're spiraling, and I'm worried about you." Sharon's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of defensiveness. "I'm not spiraling, Nick. I'm fine. I don't need the medication. I'm not sick." Nick's eyes narrowed, patience wearing thin. "Sharon, you're not fine. You've been talking to people who aren't there. Mariah told me about Cameron." At the mention of Cameron's name, Sharon's face went pale. She turned away from Nick, hands trembling. "You don't understand," she muttered, barely loud enough for him to hear. "I don't understand?" Nick's voice rose with disbelief. "Sharon, you're talking to a dead man. You need help. We need to get you to a hospital to see a doctor." Sharon shook her head violently, backing away from Nick. "No, I don't need to go to the hospital. There's nothing wrong with me. You're all overreacting." Nick ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "Sharon, please. I'm trying to help you, but you're making it impossible. You can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. You need to take your meds. You need to see a doctor." "I'm not crazy, Nick," Sharon screamed, her voice echoing through the room. "I don't need a doctor. I don't need anyone." The room fell into a tense silence, weight of Sharon's words hanging in the air. Nick could see the panic in her eyes, the desperation behind her anger. She wasn't thinking clearly, and he knew that something had to change before things got worse. But just as Nick was about to press further, Phyllis's presence loomed in his mind. He knew that Phyllis wouldn't approve of him getting too involved in Sharon's issues. She had always been protective of their relationship, and had made it clear that she didn't want Nick focusing too much on Sharon. Phyllis saw Sharon as a lingering shadow in their lives, constant reminder of the past that refused to fade away. Nick felt torn. On one hand, he cared deeply about Sharon. They had a long history, and despite everything, part of him still felt responsible for her well-being. But on the other hand, Phyllis had made it clear that she didn't want him to get entangled in Sharon's problems. Nick wasn't sure how much more he could intervene without jeopardizing his relationship with Phyllis. The argument between Nick and Sharon intensified, with neither willing to back down. Sharon was adamant that she didn't need help, while Nick insisted that something needed to be done. The frustration between them boiled over, and it became clear that words alone wouldn't be enough to resolve the situation. Nick knew that Sharon needed a strong intervention, something that would force her to confront her declining mental health. But without Sharon's cooperation, he felt powerless. He couldn't drag her to the hospital against her will, and he couldn't force her to take her medication. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Nick was running out of options. Yet, despite his concern for Sharon, Nick found himself holding back. Phyllis's influence weighed heavily on his mind, and he knew that if he pushed too hard, could create tension between him and the woman he loved. Phyllis had always been wary of Nick's connection to Sharon, and she wouldn't take kindly to him getting involved in Sharon's personal struggles. As the argument between Nick and Sharon raged on, Nick felt trapped. He wanted to help, but the complications in his own life made it difficult for him to fully commit to Sharon's well-being. He knew something had to change, but finding the right solution seemed nearly impossible. Would Nick be able to help Sharon without losing Phyllis? Or would his inability to act lead to Sharon's further decline? The stakes were higher than ever, and the resolution remained uncertain. This was a situation where love, loyalty, and obligation clashed in the most painful of ways. And for Nick, the lines between what he wanted and what he needed to do never been more blurred.